Hey there, this is Derek Murphy of creativity.com. I've talked a lot about cover design on this platform and on my blog for the last couple of years, but recently I was on a marketing summit and I quickly took a few notes about the things that I recommended people consider when they're designing their own covers. So I thought I would make a video, and rather than just talking through these 7 points, I'm actually going to show you using one of my Photoshop templates. I am using Photoshop, but you can make your cover in a lot of different tools. These are kind of universal cover design templates, specifically for any kind of fiction and for a lot of nonfiction also, but not all nonfiction. Also, I jotted these down kind of in the order that they came to me, not necessarily in the step-by-step process I would usually use to make covers, and I'm going to show you what they look like with examples from this big Photoshop file that I have, which is why I've kind of started with this background template with no image, just so you don't start off with something in mind. I do have some color options set up. I also have some gradients, which is where I get my shadows. And this is just a vignette. It's like a transparent PNG vignette image. You can Google like vignette and you'll get a bunch of these. So I just put those in, they darken the edges. That tends to work to kind of focus on the central image, and I'll show some more stuff about that later. But I'm just starting this off so that I've got kind of an empty void to get started with. And the first thing I want to talk about is the font, because the font dictates the genre. So it's important to get the fonts right. We'll talk later about typography and spacing and elements and all of that stuff, but this is just going to be the basic title font, because different fonts will suggest different genres. Altogether, your cover needs to be very, very clear about what the genre is. So it's a combination of the title words, like the words of the title, which give an indication, but also the mood and the colors, also the character's dress, the background, and the settings. That's all kind of part of where the story takes place. It helps to communicate the genre, but a lot of the heavy lifting is done with the title font. So if you have the wrong title font, or if you have a title font that's just a little bit too plain and it's not communicating the genre, that's going to slow you down. So this project specifically was for a young adult fantasy. So I already went ahead, like what I often do when I'm starting a project is I'll just brainstorm a bunch of fonts. I have probably 20 or 30 different really good fantasy fonts that work for a fantasy book cover. I'll show you what some of them are, and I'll talk about how even within a certain category, like young adult fantasy is still a very broad category, so different fonts will suggest a different subgenre. So I'm just going to be clicking on these. I'm actually going to darken the background because these are all in white text. So rather than changing that like I would normally do if this was a lighter cover, I would have darker text. I'm just going to go ahead and darken this background so that you can see it a little more clearly. So I just have to find this one layer. I think I've got just like a drop color layer. So obviously this already changes the mood quite a bit, especially with this really heavy vignette border. That gives it a really mysterious, moody feel. I might actually take some of these out because it's a little too dramatic for what I'm starting with. And let's go with something super plain like that. So here's an example of a lot of these fonts. They'll have fancy glyphs and regular typography also. So especially with fantasy, you want to be careful about, like I wouldn't want every letter to be fancy because that's just too much. So with a lot of these fonts, you'll have the option of making some of the letters fancy. Often it's like the larger caps are fancy and the lower caps are not fancy, but in Photoshop, most likely a lot of the fonts are also going to have different glyphs down here, which you can play around with or change. This one doesn't. It just has the big and the small basically. And you have to kind of decide if that's going to look okay or if that's going to be too much. I don't actually love that that particular font, but it might make sense for some stories. So here's the nice one that's basically just a serif font. It's a little bit interesting. It's got a couple of unique um, signature styles, basically with the B and the K. I wouldn't overdo it, and these are like, this is a little too curvy for me, where I have the L and the E both with this curvy bottom, which I don't love. So a font like this looks a little bit dated, so I really like the really sharp K, which gives it kind of an edgy, a little bit of violence. You know, it kind of hints at danger. But it also sort of has that like older library parchment type feel. Here's something that's very different. This is the sans serif. It's a very tall font. What you don't want to do is have a font and then stretch it out. A lot of amateur book covers, they'll take a font file and they want to make it taller, so they'll just stretch the font bigger. You don't want to do that because it gives it a stretched look. There are blocky, tall fonts like this. I think this one's Steelfish, but there's a variety of tall, blocky fonts which look really good. Particularly, this would be a thriller font for most mysteries or thrillers. And actually, if it was like a detective mystery or a cozy mystery, I would want something more like a serif font or even a cute serif font. This is more like a hard action detective noir, hard-boiled type of story. So here's another one that's very rough. You have to be careful with the rough fonts because if it's too rough, it's illegible. There are some similar fonts that are really broken and hard to read. This one's sort of a good mix where there's a lot of gritty texture. And actually, for a lot of the times, if I wanted a texture like this, I wouldn't get a font with texture. I would just put a texture overlay to the typography, which I'll show you how to do later. But this could be for like a hard dystopian, for example. Dystopian also, you sort of want like a sci-fi futuristic font for dystopian. I would lean towards something, depending on what type of dystopian it is, I'd lean towards something cleaner and more sci-fi. However, there's a big difference between like post-apocalyptic dystopian and sci-fi dystopian. I move this down so you can see the fonts up here. So this one is Vander Ink. It's a really cool, interesting font with or without these fancy, you know, the first letters, which you may not need because the font's already pretty distinctive. Also, this is going to depend on, like, not every cover is going to have two words, and maybe, you know, book title, maybe the B and the T don't really look great together. Maybe this font doesn't work as a two-word title, but it might look really nice as a one-word title. So you have to know what your book title name is in order to really get the right font for it. Here's another really interesting one called The Frontman. This is it almost looks like there's a really famous dystopian series called Allegiant. So it kind of looks like the Allegiant font, although it's not this one, but this is definitely like a cool, interesting sci-fi dystopian font. This one is Sirona Sans. It's really similar to Bebas New, which is really popular in comment, especially for nonfiction. Nothing fancy, it's just a really clear, strong book title. So if I was going to use something this simple, I would probably add a little bit of gradient or text style. And I'll show you more about how to do that stuff later. The problem with a simple one like this is it's not doing a lot of communication about the genre. So the background art and the character and the setting would have to be really strong for the genre and the setting and stuff to get away with this simple of a font. And the inverse is true also if you have a pretty simple background or like a symbol character, a symbol cover, which I won't recommend. And I'll talk more about why later, but mostly it's because it's very easy not to communicate the genre with your book cover. I was just looking at one today. Someone was asking for feedback on a young adult fantasy cover. And the problem was, yeah, it kind of looked like young adult fantasy, but nothing was communicating the genre well enough. So like it was well designed, it just didn't have any information because it was a symbolic cover with a simple serif font. It was kind of pretty, kind of attractive, but it didn't tell me anything about the story. This one is Roller Coaster. It's got a couple of interesting choices. So for example, this is one of those fonts that has more options down here. So instead of just choosing, big or small, I can also selectively choose some letters if I want to give them a little more flair, or choose which letters get that flair, which gives you a lot more options for, designing it all and making it look good. And I kind of like this one because it's, it could be very, very simple on its own if you didn't do anything fancy to it. But you could just have like one or two letters get a little fancy. The trick is not to make it too overwhelming or too distracting. So even something maybe like this with the first and the last, yeah, I don't know if that works for two words, but there's some choices to play with. I kind of like this, especially because it's serif and because it has some fancy. This is like a friend of mine is working on a time travel, young adult time travel fantasy, and that's a really tricky genre to get right. So for sort of like a adventure detective time travel type of thing, this tall serif font works pretty well. For a little bit of magic and fantasy, this fancy font works. If I could figure out, how to make it all look good in one, if it matched the title well enough, that might be a strong choice. This one's called Requiem. And given the title, like Requiem is usually associated with horror and stuff, this kind of looks like it could be a horror ghost story, even like a murder mystery. However, I could also see it on something like a children's book, like a sort of fantasy attic type story, if that makes sense. Like a little bit of mystery and intrigue, Nancy Drew type of stuff with ghost mysteries. The other rule of cover design is basically the heavier the design, the younger the audience. This is also true in interior book formatting. So something really distinctive and fancy like this does communicate really well. It's a really interesting font, but it looks a little bit youngish to me, like something that would be on a middle grade fantasy as opposed to an adult or a young adult fantasy. This is Portmanteau, and it's pretty similar to the last one. It's just kind of a faded, gritty serif font. So it is a really clean, simple font. I was also going to say about that last one, it's almost too distracting depending on what other elements you have. If your image is already really distracting or really busy, I would want a simpler, cleaner font. So this would be kind of a nice compromise where it still has some character. It's still a little bit more character than like just a plain, clean serif font, but it's not sort of too overwhelming. It's very clean and easy to read. This one's called Morpheus, and there's quite a few fonts that look very similar, so you've probably seen something similar, especially for like urban fantasy. So this works for urban fantasy more. The difference between urban fantasy and other types of fantasy, epic fantasy is a pretty distinguished genre with certain tropes that's set in not a historical time, but like an epic, different world time. Urban fantasy is set, in a more modern, realistic setting. A lot of best-selling urban fantasy right now tends to be kind of gritty city stuff, kind of urban. So it sometimes has very blocky sans serif fonts, like some of the ones I showed you earlier. This one would be more for like witchcraft, paranormal. I actually think this is a little too recognizable and a little overused. On the other hand, it's great when you can find a nice looking font that's recognizable for your genre. Like it's sort of overused in that people kind of know what kind of book it probably is. So if you use it right, it's not unattractive. It's just a little bit common, but it's still a pretty nice font. It is very distinctive. There's a lot of extra elements. One of the ways you could get around that is maybe if I wanted to take out, the squares inside the circle, which are a little bit too much, I could either just replace these O's with a different font that doesn't have that in the center, or I could flatten this and then just delete the inside. I don't do a lot of like font tweaking, but that's one way to make really distinctive fonts. So I could delete a few things. I could, um, move or edit a few things, just kind of like move them around. That's something you can do in Photoshop. Here's another I find really interesting. This is Moody Blue. I don't think I've used it on a book project yet. It's very pretty and very distinctive. So you'd kind of have to, it'd be great for branding a series, but you kind of have to make sure it really fits. To me, this looks like a Fae fantasy, so I should have used it on my Fae series. Maybe I'll rebrand those someday. But I went with the pre-made, so I chose the pre-made font, the font that the pre-made came with basically for that particular series. And my Fae series is a little bit more like a typical young adult Fae series is more magic, happy fantasy. My Fae series is very dark urban fantasy. So this one might actually be like a little too pretty, a little too magical. This is more like an elf or fairy epic fantasy. Another interesting one is called Limit Corner. And this is one of those fonts I think that has a lot of different options. So in Photoshop, you can choose, you know, with each of these letters, it gives me several different cool options. So I can really get a very distinct look for what I'm going for. And even these, like I'd probably, I mean, the chances that you have double O's in your book cover is not that common. But if I did have double O's, I would find those distracting. So I'd probably go with the simple O's. Little stuff like that. You just don't want to overdo it with the fancy stuff. You want it to look pretty clean and be readable. Another really fancy one is Hamilton Ornate. Looks like this. It's also just really unique. It's a really hard angular feeling, but it also has some fantasy. So this is more like for a vampire paranormal where, it's thorny basically. It's thorny, but it also has a gothic look. So it's kind of like, the older gothic. If you search gothic fonts, you'll find a lot of really hard edged older fonts. So like I mentioned, even if it's urban fantasy or epic fantasy, that's not a small enough subgenre. Is it ghosts? Is it vampires? Is it a witch? You can choose a style that fits, the main subgenre or topic of your book or the theme of your book. This one is called Palash. It's just a very, very simple, clean serif font. There are lots of different kinds of serif fonts. I would probably try not to use Times New Roman or a very common one. This is one that just has very distinct feel. So this could be on like a legal thriller, like the Pelican Brief or something. It kind of has that classic look. It kind of looks like the Time magazine title or something. It's a little bit plain for a lot of fiction, but depends on the kind of fiction. For a memoir or something, it'd probably be fine. Even for some fantasy or sci-fi, I mean, fantasy or sci-fi, I don't think this one communicates enough. But if the background really sells the genre hard, and you're looking for kind of a simple, timeless serif font, this would be a choice. This one's called Disturbo, which is really an interesting font. It's a little bit too distinct and too broken, but especially for like a thriller, like a modern psychological thriller, this could be a really smart choice. And then, like I mentioned earlier, with too fancy font, it's going to look more middle grade. Like the bigger the design, the younger the reader. This is almost like it gives me like a Cleon vibe, so kind of like a sci-fi Star Trek type of vibe, maybe like even Alien, possibly demons. And if you're wondering why sci-fi instead of fantasy, it's mostly because of the hard edges. So like even though it's thorny, even though it's got a lot of decorations and some sharp things here, like this has a vampire feel, but it's not really communicating genre because it has those hard squarish edges. It's a little bit more of a sci-fi feel. So like if you had a sci-fi vampire book, this would be like a good choice for it, or like maybe an alien romance book or something, but it's very strong. So you'd have to match this font with the right project. I do have a couple of other serif fonts. There's another one I liked a lot, which is just Dream Caps. And this one is, I don't even know really what this is, Vectis. But this is like, these are interesting serif fonts that are very distinctive. I don't even know if I could make this work in a title. But if like the L and the E, they don't really belong together because they're both so long. So you can't really have LE in your title unless you made it all small, but that's not really the point. But if, for the right project, if you did it right, this could be a really unique, interesting font. If I did use, like, this is sort of giving me, I don't know, like a haunting, like a really serious haunted house type vibe. And if I was going to use it for a project like that, I would probably do a little bit of text effects or tweaking. And I'll show you what that might look like just for fun. So if I went down here and I would duplicate this layer just to kind of keep a background copy I can change. And then I would try flattening this layer. I think I could just go to rasterize type, which will kind of turn it into an image. And then I could take my blur tool, or maybe even the smudge tool down here with like a 36 strength, and then I could just very gently move things around, which gives it kind of that slightly floating, wispy kind of look. You could do this on any project, but I think especially like a little bit of a spooky ghost story or something, just to give it like a little bit more of a distinctive feel. I'd probably add that with some smoke or something. And then if you wanted to go a little wilder, you could do a really heavy blur or whatever. Or you could do something like this with a very small size and just kind of, well, that didn't quite work. But something, I mean, anything you can do just to kind of make it more distinct and more interesting. Just a couple more. This one is called Swashington. I'm including it because, like, for me, this is a bit too, I don't know, nice, maybe. Like, it's a pretty font, but this is more for, like, a historical romance. Maybe Renaissance, although I don't really know my historical romance century design as well as I should. Like, there are certain fonts that harken to certain centuries or even decades, so you should probably do some research. But, for most historical romance, a pretty font like this, you would search for like fonts with swashes basically, and you might come up with something like this, but this is Swashington. This is a pretty cool looking font. And the other one is this one, which is Regal Swash Pro. Normally I probably would shy away from using italics in a title. This is an italic font, so it kind of just comes that way. It's really distinctive. It stands out. I don't know it would work for all projects, but for certain types of memoirs, I think it could work really well. Possibly for certain kinds of fantasy. There is like, it's unique. There's a lot going on. I like it a lot, but it doesn't really communicate one particular genre very well. So that's, again, when you'd have to have a really strong background. This one is Brillon. And there are probably like 5 fonts that you see on almost all fantasy and urban fantasy because they're just really popular. This is one of those. And one of the reasons, it's beautiful, it looks really good, but there's also a lot of different choices. So you can pick and get a really distinct look. This one is called Quardos. And I like this font because it has some really unique, interesting things that are kind of thorny. This could be, in my opinion, like for a werewolf book. I don't know how to really describe why this fits werewolf and not vampires. Like it is sharp and thorny in some places. It just looks a little more organic and natural. This is Cinzel. Cinzel Decorative is one of those other ones that you see all the time on all the book covers just because it's simple, it's clean, it looks really good. It's not like too distracting, but it's still pretty elegant. This one is called Keurig Pro. So it's similar to some of those other ones that I showed you, but also just a little bit unique and different. I really like the long K, so you know, depending on your title, some of these fonts make sense more than others. It can be worth it just for like one long K. And the other thing to keep in mind is like if you find, a clean serif font and you just need a long R or a long K, if you know the other fonts that you need, like you can use sometimes you can use one font for most of the words and then replace just one specific letter like this if you have to. Or in Photoshop, if you flatten the layer, I could cut off the tail of a K and put it on another K if like this K doesn't fit the other font. So there are ways of combining the fonts to make it really unique. Another one I like is Finord. So as a designer, because I design a lot of fantasy, most fantasy readers, they really like the long tail words. So Finord is just one of those that like most of it looks like a pretty simple serif font. It's a little bit blockier. It's not quite as like elegant as some other serif fonts. But the K and the R are really great. So even if you just need a K or an R, it might be worth, a font like this. And I think there's some choices. I don't know what all the choices are. But for example, this font has a really nice Q as well. You can even, if you don't have it in all caps, you can make some choices with like the E to make it sideways. So there's some really interesting choices, like not a lot, but like just enough to tweak it so it looks really great. This one is Rebecca, which is also really cool, Rebecca Deco. More of like a circusy font, so this is a little bit too strong for a lot of things, but for like a really good carnival circus type of book, that could work really well. I didn't realize I had so many fonts, but I'm gonna just keep showing them to you. Maybe I'll just turn this into a font video, but LHF Encore, it's a really, really pretty one. And this one is Desire Pro. This is another one of those, I mentioned the top 5 fonts you see on all fantasy covers. Desire Pro is another one, mostly because there's just so many options. Especially in the lowercase, there's just so many different font options. You can get a very unique style for your whole title. I'd be careful with Desire Pro, like not to overdo it with everything. But it really is very pretty. The other one that's on the top of my mind is Yana. I don't think I have Yana in here. It's Yana. It's also a very nice, very pretty fantasy font. Here's another rough, blocky serif called Decade. Good for apocalyptic, maybe. This looks a little bit more zombie to me. The bolder, the blockier the font, the more action adventure it's going to be, probably. This one is Black Panther, also super cool. Very thorny. For like a monster book, I would guess. And Amira Beauty, also very cool because it's got that bold serif, like tall serif, like even without any glyphs. I really like fonts like this that are almost normal, but then they also have a few options so that you could make like and you can also just, I don't have this handy, but you don't need a font like this. You could have any serif font that looks kind of like this, and then you could get a package of the ligatures, which are these like lines, because there are fonts that are just those lines basically. So you could just grab those lines and put them around your typography just to give it that unique feel. But this is a font I really like. I'll try to use it somewhere. This one is American Frights for like a middle grade horror type of book. It'd be hard to make this, to pull this off well. It's a little bit too bold and blocky. What I'd probably do in a case like this is I would make the letters smaller and give them more distance. so that it doesn't take up so much room and it's not so distracting. It's still a very distinct font. And because it's so bold, you don't really need it to be so big. And this one is Anthique Alt. More of like a historical kind of piratey feel. Here are some more blocky sans serifs. This one is Agency FB. This one is Alter Regular. So these blocky serifs are good for thrillers, detectives, possibly sci-fi dystopian. This one is Ailerons. There's a few of these that are more sci-fi because you see how like it's just a little bit curved. It just gives it a little bit of that futuristic look. So this would be more for like a UFO or an alien one. And this is AF car plates. So this is basically just a standard square serif font. However, it's got a little bit of an interesting, an extra twist, a little bit curvy. So like also for young adult sci-fi, I think like a standard general sci-fi. And I'll end with a couple more regular serif fonts just in case you want something really clean. This is King's Castellan. This one is Balerno. And this one's Silver South. A lot of places where you buy typography, like Creative Market, for example, kind of sells like typography pairs because with design, it can work really well to balance pairs. This isn't going to work for a lot of things, but specifically for romance, for like modern romance, it can work really well to have a blocky serif or sans serif mixed with a really good handwritten font. So rather than trying to decide those pairings yourself, the other problem with the handwritten fonts is they don't do spacing very well, so you probably want to set it at 0 spacing. And like the problem is if it's a word that's not very legible in that font, you want to rethink it. But sometimes pairing a handwritten font with, a very clean serif font, especially if it's a pre-packaged pair that just looks good because it was designed to look good together, that can work really well for some genres. All right, so we've talked a lot about fonts already. I hope that I've conveyed how important it is and how they communicate different genres. It's really just the beginning, but it's also such a big step, so you really want to try to get it right. The next one on my list, number 2, is colors and mood. A problem a lot of new authors make is there's just too much colors. Everything is just going on. And the way that you fix that is with a color wash or an overlay. And I'll show you more about blending those later once we get the character in the background. But just real quick, let me just throw in a background so you can see it. So here's a very simple background. So this is obviously like, detective, thriller, almost like a Jack the Ripper type feel with the cobblestones. And so if this is my background, I'm going to try to put it behind. I've got a bunch of color layers. So my color layers basically look like this. I have different hue and gradient saturation layers. I've got this half gradient to darken the bottom where I'm going to put the author name. That's something I'll usually do. I'll have different layers of the vignette. And the interesting thing about vignettes, I will usually put mine to an overlay blend. This one's at 39% opacity. I tend to use several and figure them out. But the interesting thing about vignettes is when you do overlay, it'll darken the edges around the side, but it will lighten all of the center stuff. So even though this is just white, basically, overlay sharpens everything. So there's white in the middle. So any of the light texts, it'll bring it out and make it brighter. So especially when you have a central character here, that extra brightness is really going to be important. So that's why these vignette layers are great. But colors also make a big difference. So I have, for example, this is a hue and a saturation layer, which looks like this, which is handy to have because then I can just change the color however I want it. I can add, increase the saturation or decrease it. I can increase the brightness, although that doesn't really work the way I want it to here. So depending on, the setting or the mood, I could change the colors really easily this way. Or I also probably have a bunch of color overlays that are set to different blending. Multiply makes things darker, but I can set it to lighten. screen. Like for example, if I took away this vignette and I just lightened it all, that already has a very different mood. So depending on your blend, like it's not just about the colors. Standardly, I would just go to color. If I wanted, to make this green, I would just add a color overlay. I would change it to color or hue. But I could also play around with the different blending modes just to see how things are going to look. And maybe one of the blending modes looks really good, but I don't like, the color. So I could go back up here to my hue and saturation and change one of these. The other thing I like to do is a gradient level, which looks like this. This is set to color dodge, but I'm just going to put it to color. And so this is a gradient, which means it has different colors. You want to be careful about which two colors you're using. You want to use contrasting colors. But for example, purple and green does pretty well. Depending on your genre too, like there are different types of urban fantasy which tend to be certain colors. So if you research your market, you'll sort of start figuring that out. So because purple and green are contrasting colors, that's sort of natural point of contrast. I could still play with the hue and the saturation. And then I could also play with the blending layers. So the color, even though I haven't really put anything there yet, it's just a blank background, it's basically about feeling. So the colors are the mood that you want people to feel. So it's not genre specific, it's mood specific. Different colors make people feel different things. You can do any Google search on like colors, emotions, and kind of get a general sense. It's not scientific with cover design. You really want to look at what trends are in your genre without copying exactly one author. If one author's branded a whole series a certain way, you can get a feel for the general colors that you see on. If you look at the top 100 of your subcategory, it's not all going to be the same, of course, but there'll probably be 2 or 3 different main color combinations that you can identify. So you just pick one. The other thing that can work really well is having a different color for each book in a series. If you were going to do that, rather than doing gradients, I would just use one different color. So like the first cover could be orange. I kind of like this because it's a really strong, bold, kind of sunny color. So this is a screen. So if I did another color for the same series, I would just choose the same blending mode. Oops, that didn't work. I'm not really sure why that didn't work, but I think it's because the green is lighter. So the screen is too light with the green color. But I could try, I don't know, another blending mode to get kind of that same feel. You don't want to overdo it so it looks overexposed or too bold or too bright. But you also don't want to be too moody. A lot of my covers are subtle, and it's not terrible to just have a very colorful cover that kind of stands out. You want to be careful about having too many covers fighting for attention. Your eye is going to go to a certain thing. So like you could have one point of contrast in a different color. I tend to do like my characters, I'll give them different magic colors from the background so it stands out, but that may not be the greatest choice. It's going to matter if you have a magical cover with magic because then the lighting is going to be on the character. It's going to kind of change everything. But I would caution towards one main color for the whole thing if you can. So that was point number 2. Point number 3 is the setting. So this is the place or the background. This is going to communicate, like even if it's a time travel, it's the main time period and location, geography of where this book is set. Sometimes, like if it's a fantasy, a lot of fantasies have like a girl in a dress running in a forest. The forest doesn't really communicate the specific setting, but it does communicate the genre. Paranormal romance, people usually picture something like, running through the forest. I do have a bunch of scenes saved, so real quick, I'll just try to flip through some of them to give an indication of how things can look. I often also sometimes combine scenes. These colors are going to wash out the background scene, so this is too much. But you can see how the colors, do a big difference on the scenes. But for now, like if, for example, this forest scene doesn't fill the top, I would have to put something in the foreground here, which I would probably get from a different picture. I would just blend it on the bottom half. I'm not sure if I have one ready to go. Looks like I might. So these are some elements I've already kind of played around with. Okay, so for example, I threw this together really quickly. This is just, let me change some of the colors. You also want, like, the colors can really wash out the background. On the one hand, it gives a very emotional mood and it makes it all look like one picture. So you don't really need to blend it really carefully because it just kind of all looks, like the same scene. But then you lose some of the nice contrast in the colors. So I might want to play around a little more. To get it how I want it. But this is a pretty cool mood scene. You want a lot of light and contrast, which shows depth, but you also want to make sure that the title stands out on its own. So this is just, a few pictures taken from other pictures of the bottom. I just kind of roughly cropped it out and then, added a few more layers for some different kinds of texture. But I didn't blend it very well. It looks pretty good. It's a very specific mood and theme. But if I use something like this is just another picture. This is definitely gritty, urban, possibly dystopian, although I want to say this is like a locker room type of scene. Sometimes you can get away with just one really good background. Here's one that's just like, it's a moon and forest. It's just one picture from Deposit Photos for a background. If I blended in the bottom or just even, darkened it or whatever, it would be fine. So it's a little bit rough, but already like that hugely changes. Like if I have a central character here, now it's a werewolf story, for example, instead of something different. Especially if I change the color into something, very striking, different color. I'm just real quick going to show you some of the different backgrounds that I've got saved. Something like this is almost too simple. Even if I put like a character standing here, it's where I would put a character. I'll talk about that next. But I might want to do something like put a big castle on one of these faraway mountains or something if it was going to be fantasy. Depends on your level of Photoshop, whether you can get away with just a really simple background image, which you probably can, but if you use a simple full background image, it'll be more recognizable, which you want to try to avoid. Here's just kind of a gritty European city for like a thriller. Moody landscape. Even like, I really like landscape scenes. They have really nice texture, especially for the bottom, but they don't really communicate the genre as much as they should. So like, is this an urban setting? There would be a cityscape in the background. Is this a fantasy setting? There would be a tall castle over here and a moon probably. This one's a misty forest, probably better for like a ghost story. You can find some fantasy backgrounds and stuff like this that are ready to use, but are not really unique. So you may, find the perfect image, and you can get away, like it's not illegal to use an image that's been used before. It happens all the time. So if you find the perfect image, go ahead and use it. Just know that it's not, completely customized art, which is also fine. You want the strongest cover, not the one that communicates the episodes or the scenes in your story, the one that hits the genre the hardest. Here's another kind of misty urban scene. For like an urban fantasy, you're going to want a city scene or an alleyway. For a thriller, you would have like either a moody guy standing here, or what's really common in thrillers is you have a character running away in a trench coat, kind of like a silhouette. You want to be careful about silhouettes because they can look cartoonish in 2D, unless it's a real silhouette with actual lighting as part of the picture. Otherwise, it can be easy to get wrong. Here's a really cool, obvious kind of Greek mythology one. My Greek books, I have pretty strong covers for my Greek mythology series, but they just weren't obvious enough about this is Greek mythology, based on Greek mythology. So I recently redid mine with like pillars and statues of Zeus and stuff. You want to communicate the genre if you can. I have a lot of pillars in here because I like them. They make for a good background. Here's another one. I would have to fix the sky or the foreground. I would probably fix the sky because it's easier, or maybe a little bit of both. So I'd move this down here and just replicate some of this bottom to fill this space. And then I would find a picture of the sky basically and just blend that in up here. That's pretty easy to do. I'm not sure. Here's a sky picture. So if I have sky, you just want to take your deleter, basically your eraser tool. I'm going to try that's too big. So I'm just kind of deleting some of this. And this is almost too small because then there's a hard, even though it's soft, it's still a hard edge between the dark and the light. So ideally you'd find, something that doesn't take away too much, but is big enough that it, hides the transition a little bit. Anyway, so that's not perfect, but to fix the sky or improve the sky, you just get a sky that matches, fill something with the bottom, and then you have a whole landscape. A lot of the cool background images you find on stock photo sites are going to be landscape sized, so you're probably going to have to learn how to fill the top and the bottom, but a really easy way to do that is just find another image and delete half of it basically and just move it around so it looks good. And you can also try some blending layers. Like if it's too light up here, if I duplicate this layer and I go to multiply or overlay, multiply makes things darker. Then it's just not as obvious a transition because it matches the darkness. And then once I go back up to my colors again, I can make it even smoother just by increasing the colors or the contrast. So the other thing, see how this one has really nice red lights? So I'd have to decide if I want to leave those lights red or if I want to do a color wash on top of that image, which might change the color of the lights. So for example, just to get rid of the color, the lights are cool that they stand out, but they're also a little bit distracting because contrasts draw out the eye. So if I don't want the eye to focus on those lights and I want them to focus on something else, then I would just, put a color over the top. So here's one that's just a deserted, street scene. It actually kind of looks cool with that water there. That's from a different picture. It doesn't belong there at all. But I'll bet if I blended it in really well and made it look like it belonged there, that would just look really cool. So sometimes you get happy accidents when you're playing around. This is just another one where I would have to smoothen that bottom a little bit so that I have one, background. It's also hard to find a good ruined city for a dystopian. There's a lot of stock images, but they all look the same, which is fine because, hopefully once you have the characters and the text, they're going to look at the character and the text. The background is just to communicate the setting. They're not really going to look carefully at the details, which is fine. This is more like a weird sci-fi futuristic city. I don't know exactly how I would make that look, but I might want that to be a lot bigger because it's really small. Depends what I'm doing with it, but I might want to just, increase the size of that. It's nice if you can have a picture with a light source in the middle. That's why I really like alleyways or arches or pillars, because then it looks really natural. There's a light source coming from inside, so your character that's in the center, it's going to draw their eye and you can fix the lighting around them. We're going to do that in the next stage, but starting with an image that has like a natural light source in the middle is helpful. Here's another one, just a random ruined city. I paired this in one of the covers I was designing recently. I paired it with that stairwell that I used earlier. Let's see if I can show you that again. I must have deleted some stuff. So basically like that, which was really cool because, otherwise like this is a pretty common ruined city. I had some characters here. That's fine. But adding this extra bottom element just made the lighting really different. It makes the setting really different. It gives it kind of a unique feeling. And then I've also got some sci-fi backgrounds, which are basically just texture. So like this, for example, would be pretty boring, but it's really clear and strong about the genre, like a sci-fi or dystopian, possibly alien. Here's another one that's a little bit more space sci-fi. So even though these are really simple and boring, with a few more elements, with the central character, really good typography, this could be a really strong cover. Here's another one that's very, very witchy. I had a pre-made with this before. This is a stock image. It just came this way, and I could just put a character here. It's already got a lot going on. It's a little bit too distinctive for me because all these elements came together. So I'm going to see other covers that have the same background. Readers probably aren't going to notice that, but it does bother me a little bit. And this is also very spooky, very Halloween witchy, which doesn't really fit a lot of my books. Here's another one that's nice that I like, kind of for fantasy. Here's just a regular, background for like a thriller. For psychological thrillers, often in the city or with an object or an element. But a lot of other kind of like mystery thrillers with a missing person often have trees or forests in the background. So even something pretty spooky like this could be thriller or could be paranormal, depending on the fonts and the central character. And here's something that's sort of the beginning of an epic fantasy. Epic fantasy tends to have like bigger landscapes. I'll talk more about this later, but generally, like the bigger the story, the more horizon you can see, the more they have to go, the further the journey. Whereas like an urban fantasy usually happens in the city, often in like a few block radius, like maybe even all in the same building. So urban fantasy tends to focus on like one room or one building or one street and not, the expansive world. But for good epic fantasy, you really want a small character. Also, urban fantasy would have like a big character because it's more character focused. Epic fantasy would have a small character because it shows how far they have to go to focus on the journey and the adventure. And you generally want them looking towards where they're going. So this one has a sword, but that's a little bit, too much for me, too on the nose. So for an epic fantasy cover, I would probably do something maybe like this, but I think I would have to fix the foreground so that my character is like standing on a cliff looking out at the distant mountains, and then I would put like a castle on one of these mountains. I'll do that real fast just for fun. I could put some ruins in there if I wanted to, depending on if this is like ancient ruin stuff. I'd have to darken that and I'd have to change the colors for that to make sense. And then here's just some random castle. So if I did it well, I'd have to try to probably delete some of the sky and then delete some of the stuff underneath it. Anyway, so something sort of like that almost works. I mean, obviously I would clean it up a little bit, but that gives it a very fantasy feeling. And it's basically just like a nature landscape, and you just throw a castle in it. So hopefully now I've shown you that fonts and the background image and the mood and the color make a huge difference. They're like the whole thing. Well, almost the whole thing. They're a big part of the thing. So you have to consider those three things before we even get to the next step, which is adding a humanizing element or adding a character. I'm going to stop the video here because it's almost an hour. I'm a little afraid of the computer crashing and losing the video. But this is only the first three. I think the next three won't take as long, but I'll probably make a second video and I'll put them together somewhere on creativeindie.com, or you can look for them on YouTube if you're on YouTube, or if you're in my cover design courses, you should see these, in the same lecture in the cover design courses.